Could we begin where the Sunday Times have been focusing on, we were discussing today, which is in fact the story of the downfall, the last 20-odd pages of the book. And one of the interesting things you observe is that while you realised at the time that Geoffrey Howe's speech, which was like the prelude to this section of the book, was obviously damaging you, that you think it was damaging him even more.
Oh, I think it did. Very few people have made a speech like that in politics, and therefore it made it even the more important. The irony was that as a performance, it was about the best speech I'd ever heard him deliver. Much better than any he delivered from the dispatch box, but undoubtedly it was quite devastating.
And so that was the first prelude, really, and the character he assassinated, you say, was his own. And the tension builds up, you go to Paris, in fact. This is interrupting the narrative, but since we were talking about it earlier, if you had your time over again, would you still go to Paris?
Oh, indeed. I had to go to Paris. We were there signing the big international treaties on reductions in conventional armaments. We were also signing a great big kind of Magna Charta of human rights, which I had in fact proposed at Aspen. I could not, in fact, having been a main player in the East-West game, just have pulled out going to Paris. Look at the headlines there would have been.
But
and
did it
also, I was representing my country.
Yeah, but do you think it cost you votes?
It may have done. It may have done. But David, there's no point in living an if-only life. This happened. And I have written it because I had in the room with me at the time, I saw cabinet ministers one by one, two of my secretaries, so everything was taken down in very great detail. It happened. I'd had 11 and a half years. Do not let's concentrate on the downfall. Let's concentrate on the things that we did. They were years full of dynamism, purpose and action and achievement.
We'll come on to those indeed. But you asked, during that period, you come back from Paris and you've asked, the dramatic section here at the end, you've asked Douglas Hurd formally to nominate you for the second ballot.
Douglas was extremely good throughout.
And then dramatic moment, you telephone John Major in Huntington. Tell me exactly what happened.
Well, Douglas had said that he would, of course, propose me, and naturally then I turned to John Major. It just seemed to me that there was just a little kind of pause, and then I wondered, well, perhaps I was being super sensitive, as one might be at that time.
And how long was the pause?
Well, a pause is not very long, but it's a pause. You know, you're very sensitive at that time.
Yes, no, but was it?
He did. He did, and then I supported him afterwards very strongly because I thought he was the best person.
Yes, and you said, in fact, here and in the on page 861, I think it is, at the end of your account, you say here, you quote the words that you said on your way out of 10 Downing Street. Now it's time for a new chapter to open, and I wish John Major all the luck in the world. He will be splendidly served, and he has the makings of a great Prime Minister, which I'm sure he will be in a very short time. Has he made that yet?
I think he has carried out his duties. Each Prime Minister does it in their own way and in their own style. They must not be influenced or pilloried in any way by the styles of other Prime Ministers before. Each of us was different. Each of us approached our task in a different way. I was very much a conviction politician. That was part of my history. I'd come up through years of socialism. I'd seen what they'd done to Britain. So Keith Joseph and I had started again from first principles with conviction. And we'd started to work out the policies which stem from those principles. And they worked. And the irony is that there have been policies which have been followed by the rest of the world.
But has he become a great Prime Minister yet, as you predicted?
Well, give him a little bit more time.
Give him a little more time.
A little more time, and no threat of leadership elections. I myself think those elections should never take place during a prime ministership. They're invented after Ted, unfortunately, had lost 3 elections out of 4. They're invented for a time when we were in opposition. And I do not think the position of the leader of a party should be the determining factor in the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister is answerable to Parliament as a whole and the head of the government. And I hope, therefore, that the rules will be changed so that neither the present Prime Minister nor future ones, Conservative ones, should have to go through that process, which happens without any reference to the people of this country.
And so that, yes, that is a reform which has been well received, except by the 1922 community. But in general, we're going to be talking here about Thatcherism, obviously, and the Thatcher years. Is Thatcherism alive and well in 10 Downing Street?
I believe Thatcherism is alive and well, and I believe that that was confirmed very much by the Prime Minister's speech at the party conference. We're back to the same fundamental principles that influenced my policies.
Do I detect in your positive way of not making any criticisms of John Major that the recent criticisms that you've been unhelpful to him, and that people have said you, Bernardingham saying you were in danger of becoming Lady Heath, which you'd love, obviously, that in fact you've consciously made a sea change here to be more loyal to John Major?
I think, in fact, the sea change came with his speech at this party conference, and also the speeches made by many, many other cabinet ministers. They really were embracing once again what I call the true path of conservatism, which worked and which others have followed. There were differences, obviously, between the Prime Minister and myself, as we all knew about Europe and the exchange rate mechanism, but we're out of that now, thank goodness, and because we're out of it, we shall probably come out of recession faster than any other country in Europe, which is due to the Prime Minister coming out of it.
Right, and what should be the attitude to Europe now?
The attitude to Europe should be, I think, to listen to what the people feel about it. If you look throughout history, and even recent history, tyrannies are defeated not by groups of nations. They're defeated by strong nation states with strong conviction that someone who carries out an aggression must be stopped. That didn't happen by the European community. Look at Bosnia. It didn't happen by the United Nations. It happened because, in the case of Falklands, because Britain had strong convictions and strong defense. It happened when we had the Libyan raid against terrorism, because President Reagan and myself had strong convictions that terrorism must not be allowed to go on without any reaction to it. When it came to the Gulf, it was President Bush and myself, nations with strong convictions that you must stop an aggressor before he goes further. You cannot do without strong nation states confident in their own political system, confident in their own democracy. And that has been much more important in the history of this century than any European group. And therefore my vision of Europe is that we cooperate together in a free and friendly way as democracies, as nations strong in our own identity and strong in our own loyalties.
But we try to diminish the forces for political and monetary union, for instance.
I think those are quite wrong. The essence of our Parliament is that the government are answerable to our Parliament, in particular for the finances of the nation, whether it be expenditure or taxation. That was really part of the origin of it. Take it away to a single currency, and Nigel Lawson was absolutely right. Have a single currency, it means a single government, it means a single economic policy, a single monetary policy, a single interest rate, for nations which are vastly different. And he and I were absolutely at one at being firmly against economic and monetary union.
And in fact, when you mentioned there's strong nations and strong defence and so on, and in both your list of 5 important things for being a Prime Minister and the list of 3, strong defence comes in both times. The irony is, I suppose, with the passage of time and the end of the Cold War now, we have a situation where defence is the prime place that people in America, as well as here, America 20% cuts in defence, here 10 to 12% over the next 3 years. It's now defence that's the main way of balancing a budget.
I think that to weaken your defence below a certain level is very dangerous. That, after all, is what we did between World War I and World War II. There are still aggressors in the world. We've seen it from Serbia. When I went to the United Nations in 1982 to do a speech at the Disarmament Conference, I was amazed to see that after all of our experience in 2 world wars, there had nevertheless been 140 conflicts since the end of World War II. The collapse of great empires, and the communism was a kind of great empire, is not a time when you can just sit back and say everything will be lovely. It's a very dangerous time, as all sorts of other hatreds and differences come to the fore. And the only way to make certain that we can beat a tyrant whenever he shows his hand is to keep your defenses strong. And the great thing about President Reagan and President Bush and myself was that whatever we had to do We never had to think, have we got the equipment, the trained men, or the latest missiles, because wise foresight had seen to it that we have. The whole of my life, you see it in that book. The unexpected happened. When it happens, it's too late to start to produce the defenses. You've got to keep a steady, a certain minimum of defense, and you've got to keep your alliances well and in good repair.
You know the defence setup so well. I mean, what scope is there, do you think, safe scope, for cuts in defence?
After the collapse of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany, we obviously had to take quite a number of our troops out of Germany, but far from all. Don't forget, had the Americans stayed in Europe between World War I and World War II, World War II would never have happened. A tyrant is attracted by a person who is his enemy, who has weak defences. He's deterred by strong defences. But we had to take some out of Germany, and that was what Options for Change was about. Before you do any further weakening, and I'm sure this is being considered both by Kenneth Clarke and by Defence and by the Prime Minister, you must reassess your strategy. Look at the dangers in this world in which we're in. Look at what may happen in the Balkans, particularly as Milosevic has had his own way. Look what may happen, and be ready for it always. That is the essence of our freedom, our justice and our democracy, which after all is the oldest in Europe.
140 conflicts. And that's without yourself and Geoffrey
And that was
Howe.
between,
that would be
yes, that was
141.
between 1945 and 1982, and there have been others since.
Yeah.
Heaven knows, you know, look at Cambodia was one of the worst.
And you mentioned, in fact, Nigel Lawson just now. One of the things in the book which has fascinated people the most is of those parts that have been published, is the shadowing the Deutschmark from March 1987 to November. And you said, I only learnt that Nigel had been shadowing the Deutschmark when I was interviewed by journalists from the FT, Financial Times, on Friday 20th of November. That's 8 months later or whatever, 1987. Now, that's been greeted with stunned disbelief, and Nigel Lawson said cock and bull story and so on. It was a policy she was well aware of. She got a daily evening.
That is nonsense. I was astounded. I've never forgotten it, and I don't think those who came to interview me from the Financial Times have ever forgotten my vehement denial. Because if you're going to have a fundamental change of policy, which our policy was to keep inflation down, and you do that by money supply, which is by interest rates, and there's a basic change to make that secondary to shadowing a Deutschmark and gearing your future to keeping your exchange rate stable. It's not a thing which is casual. It's such a fundamental change. You need papers about it to come to the Economic Committee of the Cabinet, and you need to make a clear decision. And that is the responsibility of the Treasury to bring those papers forward. I was absolutely amazed.
But I mean, people say, but don't you get daily evening reports on what's happening in the world markets and so on, that you could have deduced it from, they say, or your principal private secretary?
The big interventions happened after that. But there are daily interventions from time to time, and the exchange rate was staying comparatively stable. After all, it has stayed comparatively stable for some time now. Since we came out of the ERM, it went up and stayed stable. There are many reasons why it can. If there's a change of policy, it's not a thing which is just done casually behind the scenes. It is done with the knowledge of the Cabinet, Economic Committee of the Cabinet, with the knowledge of the Prime Minister, not only with the knowledge, but the thing comes forward to be properly discussed. After all, as you've seen from those papers, we had many, many discussions about the exchange rate mechanism and always came to the conclusion, no.
But Nigel said it was a cock and bull story. It was a policy she was well aware of.
Nonsense. I learned at that interview, and if he changed the policy, it was his duty to come to me and the Economic Committee of the Cabinet and have a formal decision. That was not done.
Well, now, the fascinating thing about that...
I equally say, because Nigel Lawson was quite brilliant, and I don't want you to think that I automatically criticize people. You'll see from the book, Nigel Lawson was brilliant in reform of taxation, and his speeches were amongst the best drafted of any chancellor.
Before you get into the row, you were absolutely true that there are a lot of generous tributes that we should say. And mind you, occasionally the tributes too were things like, I had come to share Nigel's own high opinion of himself. So you had a little zinger even with some of the tributes too.
But the tributes were pretty generous.
Yeah, they were
Nigel
good, yes.
Rawson and I got on very well indeed.
Until the end, until near the end.
This.
But
and,
I mean,
Nigel had, yes.
Yeah, sorry, after you.
Nigel and Geoffrey had come frequently on the ERM. Geoffrey, when he was Chancellor, had been against it, became for it when he went to the Foreign Office. Nigel, who was the author of the whole money supply policy, seems somehow not to have great faith in himself to deal with it by money supply. There were certain reasons why, and wanted it more than Geoffrey originally.
But the interesting thing, coming out of the disbelief about that thing, I mean, and you're absolutely convincing there this morning that you didn't know, and so the first of the two possibilities was that you were being, to quote your old friend or your ex-friend, Alan Clark, economical with the actualité, as it were. Well, I'm convinced from the way you talked about it this morning that you really didn't know, which goes on to the second, no, it goes on to the second thing, which is, it's stunning you didn't know, and is it really therefore true that the picture we have of an all-commanding, dominant leader who was hands-on and knew everything that was going on was not true at all? And in fact, there were whole areas, like vital policy like this, where you didn't know what was going on, where it was out of control, and you were hands-off.
Look, there are 22 cabinet ministers, including the Prime Minister. You can't keep track every day of what is happening. You have a whole system to determine policy. That is the cabinet and the many cabinet committees, two of which the most important ones I chaired myself. One was overseas and defence, and the other was the economic policy. The place for changes of policy or for determination of policy is there. And that, of course, is what you expect if you're having any change in policy. But the ordinary day-to-day administration, naturally you leave to your own ministers, and you learn quite a bit from questions in the House, because you think of the questions which might come up and contact the relevant department. And as you can see again in the book, afterwards we had very, very great difficulty in trying publicly to reconcile some of the things which were going on from the Treasury, which had been going on, and a changed view from the Treasury, which was different from the view which I held, and it was very difficult. And I was very sad about it, because Nigel and I had worked very closely together, more closely indeed than Geoffrey and Nigel in the early days. And he was very, very able on certain aspects of, quite the most able on certain aspects of the Treasury.
Towards the end there, though, should I have sacked him and so on, you're asking yourself, was it practical to do it? So you felt betrayed by him over this particular issue.
I was just astonished. And it was because of that, of course, that we got inflation back. Because you cannot subordinate your interest rate. If you subordinate your interest rate to your exchange rate, it means that at a time when you're having a high interest rate, you should be having a low one, and sometimes when you should be having a low one, you have a high one. Sterling was wanting to go up above the Deutschmark. We were doing well. He was wanting to rise above the Deutschmark. And in order to keep it down, Nigel put the interest rate down, to keep it down to 3. And having the interest rate low at a time when the inflation figures were indicating that it should be high, put us into the inflation which, as you know, took us some time to get out of. And that was one of the consequences which I had to bear.
On the economic area, privatization in the book comes through as one of those things that you're absolutely most fiercely proud of. And at the end, you're clearly still working on coal, and you're having meetings about coal and also about privatizing British Rail, those two. And then you make this fascinating remark, quote, there was still much more I would have liked to do. What was that?
In the way of privatization, well, you will see that we were looking at coal, and of course you were looking at certain aspects of rail, but we'd already done quite a bit in selling off the hotels and selling off quite a bit of the property which British Railways had had. But on coal, I was very much aware of how much we owed to the working miners during the miners' strike. I knew that many coal mines were being worked out, and it didn't seem to me that you can sell coal mines unless they have a great future to the miners. And therefore I thought the best thing to do was to carry on with the colliery review procedure which the miners relied upon. And gradually, as we took out the less productive pits, then I thought we should have the chance of selling the more productive pits to a big company of which coal mining was only a part of their activity. That would have meant the miners then could have purchased shares as part of the sale and had their capital owning democracy in a big company which was not only mining, because mining being extractive doesn't always have a future unless it's involved with other things as well. And that was my idea, and I think that it may still come about. But you can't just sell, I think, the coal mines with all of the problems about safety to the miners. You have got, in fact, to do it to some bigger organization, and that should have other things in its production as well.
And what else were you thinking of? The much more else that you wanted to do in addition to those two? What was number three going to be?
We were thinking privatization. Well, we were pretty well, we were nearly through, you know, the privatization. There are one or two things still to do, but we had got pretty well.
But what was there still to do? That's why I was interested.
There was mainly coal and railways.
But then you mentioned those, and then you go on to say there were other things you wanted to do.
Oh, well, the other things are related to other things
as well. Well, it was in the privatisation paragraph.
If you look, don't forget that
would you do the Royal Mail, for instance?
There's quite a bit in the post office that we could go further and do. Quite a lot, but don't forget, there's already some privatisation there. The little postmistresses in a village are, in a way, privatization. But there is very, very much more we could do, I think, with the collection of the mail and the delivery of the mail. That is the other big thing which still has to be tackled. And other countries, ironically enough, have already done it.
And British Rail is going ahead, of course, as we speak.
British Rail, there are several ways in which you could do British Rail, and John McGregor is firmly going ahead with the one he believes in.
Is it the one you believe in?
Well, I think he's going ahead with the one he believes in, and that's the most important thing. I wouldn't quarrel with what he's doing.
And that's again, you're very on the ball on that thing today, aren't you? You don't want people to better accuse you of being a thorn. Do you think in the last 3 years that who was more of a thorn, you in John Major's side or Ted Heath in yours?
Oh, I don't think I would look at it that way. I don't think I looked at it that way at all. You see, Ted went as leader of the party, as I say, when he lost 3 elections. I never lost an election, and I never had a majority lower than 45. And most of the time I had one more than 100. So the circumstances are different. But so you can't live an if-only life. I was there for 11 and a half years. They were the 11 and a half most exciting years of my life. They were exciting for Britain. They brought Britain's reputation up. Britain meant something in the world when I left office. She really did, and that mattered to me more than anything else.
We were talking earlier what a narrow failure to win on the first ballot it was. Do you think if you'd won on that first ballot by just doing something differently, won by a narrow majority and carried on as Prime Minister, could you have, people say, well, she couldn't have united the party or the country after a contest like that. Do you think that's true?
I think we could. I think we would have certainly won the next election. Because people just knew what I stood for, knew the central direction and purpose of my policy, and I think that they would have much preferred that than what was on offer, which was Mr. Kinnock and the Labour Party, because I still don't think they trust the Labour Party not to go back to its former ways. But this is if only. It didn't happen that way. The Prime Minister came to office, John Major, and he won the last election, and now we have to concentrate on winning the next one. But I have had a most exciting life. I've had more invitations from the world over than ever I could have expected. I can influence things by the speeches I make, and that's not a bad idea, you know, to have a few elder statesmen not being gagged. After all, we should use the experience we've got to best advantage.
You mean there's nothing wrong in being a backseat driver, really?
Not a backseat driver, but I don't think you should be expected to conceal your views on any particular matter. What's the point in being in the House of Lords if you do?
And so Granny will always be there with advice, as you put it recently.
Granny will always be there with her views. It's for other people to decide what their own views are. And naturally, you may well look at the speeches which other people make. Not only the speeches, but the reasons why. So the whole of my life, there was not only what we're going to do, but the reason why, and the reason why it's right. There's always a reason why.
And in fact, one thing that's clear from your book is, we were talking there, that if you had stayed in office, you would not have done what you regret here. In fact, you would not have abandoned the poll tax, because you say here, by abandoning the poll tax, the fundamental problems remain and will get worse. You regret the passing of the poll tax.
One of the last things we did was to allocate £3 billion more to help with some of the difficulties of a group of people who are experiencing through the change from rates to community charge. And I believe that had we done that, we'd have kept the poll tax and, of course, kept the community charge. I'm sorry, it was never a poll tax. I'm falling into your trap. It was never a poll tax.
It was 50 million people have fallen into.
It is a community charge. It is a way of paying taxes to your local authority in the same way as everyone pays taxes to national authority. Of course, if we had gone on and kept the community charge as modified by the extra $3 billion, we would never have had an increase in VAT from 15 to 17.5%.
That would have saved that?
Would have saved that.
Well, it sounds as though they ought to abandon the council tax and bring back the poll tax.
I am no longer there. They will determine their own policies and have determined their own policies. I'm really rather proud of many of mine and what they did for my country. And
you think it will be looked upon, or would have been looked upon, as one of the most far-reaching and beneficial reforms ever, the poll tax?
The community charge?
I'm slipping into your trap.
I think it made councillors accountable to their electorate, and there are many, many people who are very sad at its passing. It was quite clear from the community charge you could tell how efficient your council was being, because it was so geared that you could compare the community charge from one authority to another. And at the same level of services, the community charge should have been the same everywhere. And it made councillors really accountable in a way they're not accountable to their electorates now. And accountability is a very good thing.
There was a story yesterday in the Press Association and so on that you are about to be approached by an area in Essex that encompasses Billericay to become an MEP in that particular area. Should they pursue that, or are they wasting their time?
I have no wish to become an MEP at all.
There would be a certain irony to it, wouldn't there?
Well, it's very kind of them to think of me, and obviously they've thought that I would fight Britain's corner in the European Parliament, which I would, but I have no wish to become an MEP.
What are you going to do most of next? I mean, obviously one thing is Volume 2, the Downing Street years. Here is Volume 1, and Volume 2 covering up until the Downing Street years and so on. And then there's the Thatcher Foundation. I mean, did you see that story in Business Age that said that you had managed, rather impressive this, that you had managed to amass, they were doing everybody's fortunes in there, that you'd managed to amass £63 million, which was 15 million more than Michael Heseltine.
Pounds or rupees?
Isn't it true?
Of course it isn't. My goodness me, wouldn't it be wonderful if it were? But it's just impossible.
Well, you were 15 million ahead of 63 million, which they said was divided between you and the foundation.
Absolutely absurd. Goodness me.
62 million?
No, not even. The foundation, the foundation in Britain is run by the Charities Aid Foundation of the Margaret Thatcher Fund. That's absolutely to see that everything is wholly within the lines of charity and charity law. Goodness me, as I say, are they talking about rupees or what?
But how much, what's your target to raise for the Thatcher Foundation?
Well, I don't have a target, but we do raise both here, because we have many, many requests to try to bring people from East Europe and Russia and the other countries over here to see how our kind of way of life works. And to do that, also to go over to America. So we have an American foundation as well. And wherever I am, I'm raising money for the foundation in one way or another.
Have you raised 63 billion for that? Perhaps
Good heavens, no. Nothing like.
10 million?
Nowhere near 10 million either.
Oh, well, that's very interesting, and we'll pass that part of the conversation, the transcript, over to our friends at Business Age.
I would like 10 million for the foundation.
Right. Well, there you are. If there's anybody at home with a spare 10 million, write to this address. Actually, the BBC need the 10 million even more than the Thatcher Foundation, I think.
Pennies and pounds are very welcome.
Yes, but in fact, we were talking, you're in great solid form and everything this morning at the moment. The big shock of losing office, looking back now, how long did it take you to get over it?
I don't quite know. That sounds strange, but my friends were marvellous. When I left the palace for the last time, I was driven straight away.
As a visitor, we should make it clear, yeah.
When I left the palace for the last time, as just when I'd given up my prime ministership to Her Majesty, I was driven straight away to an office which my friends had got ready for me. Straight away, they'd thought of it. My things had been moved there. All of the correspondence was coming in. All the requests, the telephone calls were coming in there. So we went in straight away. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of letters. So we had to be very, very active. There was also Christmas coming up. I had arranged Christmas at Chequers. We had to do it. There was no shortage of immediate work to do. Also, statesmen were coming through London asking to see me. So work is a great medicine. And I never stopped working. I also had, everything had been moved out of Downing Street, because you know, it is ironic that when we came up to an election, I never assumed the result of an election. So before each election, I had got everything tidied up in Downing Street and moved some things out in case I had to move out quickly. As events happened, of course, I hadn't got all my things in good order, and so they all had to be sorted out. So I had a great deal to do, and I was really very heartened by all of the support I had and by all the requests to go and lecture, to speak the world over. And because you're so busy getting on with things, goodness me, what would one do without work if you've been used to work all your life? And because of the changes in our own personal lives, which required a lot of different arrangements, it stopped me from thinking. The
so
problems. I was also quite excited.
You buried yourself in work and all of
that.
And but do you think you're out of it now, or are you still burying yourself in work?
I have I have. When I go back there for an occasion, I have just no feelings of regret at all. This happened. I totally accept it. I'm very lucky to have an active and vibrant and exciting life.
Is it true, by the way, as everybody says, that Michael Portillo, whenever John Major decides it's time to step down, that Michael Portillo would be the person that you would hope would take over as the heir to the Thatcher legacy?
Michael Portillo will be a very strong runner, because Michael has never faltered in his beliefs. I hope that a change will not come about for some time. I think it's very destabilizing to a prime minister, and every prime minister goes through a difficult period. Very destabilizing when they're constantly talking about who is going to be next, and it's destabilizing for the cabinet. They should put all their effort on supporting the prime minister now and on seeing the policies of the next Queen's speech through Parliament, and on sorting out the finances. That is Kenneth Clarke's job. He should do 2 or 3 budgets to sort out Britain's finances and to get the borrowing requirement down. That's his task, and it's a big task. It's one of the most honourable and distinguished tasks.
And in getting it down, he should focus more on spending cuts or tax increases?
You must, in fact, what every person and every business knows, keep your spending within your income. People understand that, and it's a great mistake to think that they just want more and more and more spending when they know full well that'll either drive up the interest rate or it'll mean they pay extra taxes. People have a great streak of common sense, and they can judge on the big issues, and they will know that the nation has to live within its taxable income or within a very modest borrowing at a modest interest rate.
Absolutely. And so that you would find it disappointing if the Conservatives introduced new taxes, really. I mean,
well,
ideally.
No, I'm not going to make the Chancellor's budget for him, but there are certain broad principles which we followed. Forgive me for referring to my time, but we did follow broad principles. Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson, and myself, and then the Prime Minister followed certain broad principles. And in the end, we had the last 4 years, we had a budget surplus, and we were able to redeem debt, pay back debt, which meant that we were passing on less of a burden to future generations. And that's what life is all about. Not living it up and leaving future generations to pay, but cutting the amount which they will have to pay back.
What do you think is the most self-critical thing you say in this book?
Oh, goodness me, I have no idea. I hope that it is a book which is an accurate and faithful record of what happened, and also, obviously, as other people have written about me in a very candid way, I hope that I have given credit where it's due. This most critical thing, there are several things I know. I wish that I had not gone into the ERM, had I known what was going to happen. I wish I had not eventually given and gone to the ERM, because I never really believed in it. I wish that I had been more successful with Europe in one thing. I quarrelled with them that last time because they refused to consider world trade, in other words, the GATT round. We were within 5 months of the end of the GATT round. It's been extended since then. We had to put in, if we're going to increase world trade, our proposals. We want to extending it to agriculture and also to services. Those 12 heads, or 11 other heads of government refused to discuss this urgent thing, refused to consider it. When I say we ought to consider it, it's urgent, it's imminent. This is our prosperity, it's trade. It matters to the third world, it matters to Eastern Europe. No. They sat there sullen. What I didn't know was they'd had a caucus meeting before to say they weren't going to do it. They wanted to consider something which eventually became Maastricht right into the future. It's quite typical of Europe. They wouldn't consider sometimes the immediate thing, and I wish just that I had been successful with them, because it's Europe that is holding up the completion of the GATT round on world trade.
And you wish you'd prevailed on German reunification, of course, but is there anything else large that actually
reunification, I said,
you did wrong?
You're quite right. Well, it wasn't that, I don't think I was wrong on
No,
German
that's
reunification.
what I mean. Is there anything large that you were wrong on?
Oh, goodness me, David, I'm sure I was wrong on a number of things, but you don't, I cannot think of anything immediately.
One thing that occurs to a lot of people, this week there was a story that the Department of Social Security said that there was the greatest widening of the income gap during the Thatcher years. The standard of living for the top 10% of households rose by 62% in real terms. Nothing wrong with that. But in a period when average real income rose by a third, the poorest 10% suffered an actual cut in real income of 14%. Didn't that show that trickle down does not trickle down?
I think that we would argue that particular point. We argued it many times when I was in Parliament. And you will look and see some of the answers. But let me make this clear. Look what happens in socialism, which is a push-down egalitarian society. Look what it did to Britain. Look what it did in its extreme form to communism the world over. And when we took tax down, when I came into office, the top rate of tax on earnings was 83% and on savings 98%. When we left office, it was top rate on both was 40%. But it was a far more prosperous society throughout. And the top 5% were paying a bigger proportion of income tax than they had been when the tax was higher.
Well, it's such a joy. Was unemployment a price well worth paying?
Unemployment is something you constantly try to avoid. New jobs are not created by government. New creative jobs which create wealth are created by the people. The essential thing there at a time of great new automation is to keep new small business going. For that, you must keep down the regulation and the tax so you get new small businesses. And this is why our policy was and is right against Europe's present policy, which is wrong.